Hello, hello, hello. Nice to see everybody who is here, and hopefully folks will keep trickling in. I'm still trying to figure out the best time to do these streams. I've sort of settled on 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern time, but sometimes I find that there are actually more people trickle in towards the end of the stream than the beginning. I'm not sure if that's a weakness on my part, that I'm not giving people enough notice as to when it's happening, or whether I should start later. I'm still trying to figure that out. So if you, hey, Lincoln's already in here. Awesome. So I'm still trying to sort out what the best time is, but so far 1:30 p.m. kind of works. Keeps it within that lunch hour mold is what I first started telling the streams. So that is good. No particular programming notes today. I did post a little bit earlier my first of the swords for Swordtember. That's for channel members, etc. Just for other folks if they're curious. The prompt for that one was insectoid, and Terrence drew a really cool looking sword that I don't just. And I just started looking at beetle stuff in various manuals. Finding the 3 beetles that were listed, or I guess giant beetles that were listed in the basic sets. I think it was in the basic set monster section, which was the fire beetle, the oil beetle, which I always forget about, and then I'm reminded of it. Now, oh yeah, I forgot oil beetles. Is a thing, and tiger beetles. So I ended up making 3 variants. I called them beetle blades. So there's a fire beetle blade, a oil beetle blade, and a tiger beetle blade. So that was fun. But let me get just down to brass tacks. Let's see if I can pull up the PDF. We are continuing. I can't believe I'm already to part 6. Whew, that's a lot of parts. Hopefully it's worthwhile. People keep coming in, people keep watching and telling me that they're enjoying it, so it's the best I can do. I'm still enjoying going through it. Let me know if we feel like we've tapped out what we want to cover on Worlds Without Number, but it's a thick book. There's a lot going on. In the last installment, and actually I started this, so I titled this whole series about the campaign creation stuff, but actually we're in a separate new chapter now. Believe it is a chapter on adventures. So we went from campaigns to adventures. I decided not to change the headers or do anything. It's all kind of part of campaigning, right? Go from sort of adventure, we go from campaign level stuff to adventure level stuff. So I'm keeping it under the same umbrella, so I don't want to confuse people. But now we're at that adventure level. So if we had the campaign level overarching stuff, we're in adventures now. And last time we did combat challenges, and I think there might have even been something else. Was there wilderness challenges also? No, I guess that's now. Now we're in exploration challenges. I will read the first paragraph and then go from there. Exploration challenges revolve around plumbing the mysteries of some unknown site or long-vanished ruin. Not every exploration challenge is a conventional dungeon. Searching a stretch of wilderness for points of interest is just as much an occasion of exploration as crawling through the tunnels of a buried deep. Some exploration sites teem with hostile creatures and malevolent foes, while others simply contain obscure objects or enigmatic devices that make a puzzle of their operation. The goal of an exploration challenge is to engage the players in the setting and make them think carefully about how to navigate it and its mysteries. When building them, a GM needs to stock the area with plenty of things to manipulate, steal, prod, fight, and flee from. This section will discuss one method of creating such an exploration site. There are 10,000 other ways to do it, but this one is simple and replicable by anyone who follows the steps involved. So similar to the other sections, right? We're getting a somewhat guided concept or guided set of steps for how to do this. Of course, we can do this any way we want, but he's saying, hey, this works for me, might work for you. Hey, Terrence, nice to see you. So we're getting his version of, hey, this is how I would do it. And we could take it or leave it. But we're here reading the book, so we might as well take it for now. The first step, we're going to choose the site type. If you're building an exploration site centered around a structure, you may already know what kind of edifice this dungeon is. You may have already decided to build a deep or craft a haunted castle or send the PCs into a sand-choked passage of a buried city. If you need further inspiration, however, you can use the table on page 238, which is a few pages away, for some suggestions or randomized results. If you're building a Hex Crawl wilderness exploration, your site will be the wilderness itself. It's usually best to worry about no more terrain than the PCs could cover in a single session of play. A 12 by 12 hex zone is usually plenty, assuming it's a standard 6-mile wilderness hex. Such a zone assumes the PCs will be searching it methodically for interesting sites rather than racing straight across it as quickly as possible. Yep. Then after we've chosen the type of site, we're going to choose an inhabitant framework. For structure-based sites, it may be that your dungeon is entirely devoid of inhabitants, whether bestial or intelligent. Most dungeons, or bestial, John Lennon corrected me, bestial or intelligent. Many dungeons will have something crawling around them, and it's useful to determine the general shape of its occupants early so as to let their presence flavor and influence your later decisions. I.e., if you want to establish that we're in the ruin of an elven village, you want to establish in your brain as early as possible, okay, was an elven village. That way, when you're flavoring everything, you're keeping in mind, keep adding and reinforcing that context of an elven village, or a goblin fortification, whatever you want it to be, right? I mean, that makes sense. After that, we generate rooms of interest. A structure-based dungeon is built of quote-unquote rooms, with each room being a particular defined location within the structure. An armory in a fortress might be a room, a carved plaza in an underground city might be another, and a monster-infested moat around a ruined watchtower might be treated as a room as well. A room is simply a place that has its own defining character and might contain something the PCs would want or need to interact with. So there you go. So we're using room in somewhat of an abstracted way. It does not have to actually be a room, but it is a single place that has a unifying, defining character. So in that sense, like he states, a monster-infested moat, even though it might encompass a whole castle or keep or tower or whatever, you could think about it as a room, because no matter where you are around that moat, it shares some character. If that character changes in a distinct way, then you might split that off into another section. So if the northern side of the moat is one way and the southern side is something different, then you could cut it in half that way. But if you find that it's all the same, you can easily think of it, abstract it out to, okay, it's essentially one room. A room with a view. Next, we lay out the rooms. Next, for structure-based sites, you need to establish the spatial relationships between rooms and identify any interesting topological features that exist in the dungeon. One of the easier ways to do this is to write each room of interest down on its own 3x5 index card, numbering all your rooms in order. Later, as you stock each room with its contents, you can write it down on the index card, adding notes in play to record any changes the party's actions may have caused. Excuse me for one sec, as I just reach over here to get a look at something. Okay. So, right, we want to lay things out when they're saying, okay, just you can lay, you want to establish the spatial relationships. It seems like at this point they're not so much concerned with your classic dungeon map, right? This is so far away from this thing, but you want to kind of get things set up. You could even make kind of a grid virtually or physically, right, with no cards or virtual no cards, kind of stacking them out. You could kind of set it out mind map or point crawl style, which is lines connecting them. Presumably we can add in, like, this is a passage, or this is something else, or this is a canyon, whatever it is, or these are levels, right, later. But the idea is to kind of figure out how the rooms relate to each other. Next, we can add optional map features. For structure-based dungeons, you can continue on with the stylized map as it is, or you can pause to add some additional features to the map. Yep. Oh, I should have looked back. Do they have some for wilderness? Yeah, okay, so yeah. So you don't really need to lay out the rooms so much with wilderness hex crawls, since you already have, presumably, the hex map that you're working with. Though if you were designing you could go backwards, or you could reverse the steps if you had an area and you wanted to have Sherwood Forest, some kind of river, and something else, and then you wanted to look at them in detail and then figure out where they border each other, you could do it. So you could set it up like rooms first if you didn't already have your hex MIP. So then we can add some optional map features, and then wilderness hex crawls. You don't need to do this so much. We don't really, some of the elevation details and things like that on a very micro level don't matter so much in the wilderness, but of course you can add them in if you want to. And I think also you could zoom in, right? If you wanted to take that 6 mile hex and zoom in further than some of those smaller details that you're not worried about at that 6 mile hex level, but now you're at a 1 mile hex level or even smaller, then you could fill those in as you need to or as you wish to. Next, stock the rooms. For each structure site room, decide whether a creature, a treasure, an enigma, or a distractor can be found there. Some rooms may contain several of these things, such as a creature guarding its treasure near some ancient enigma. And then we're going to have a table to do that. Pretty much, I would imagine, I think almost every version of the Dungeon Master's Guide or Dungeon Master's Rules, depending on what you're looking at, has some examples and some dungeon stocking tables if you want to use them. I'm pretty sure they're going to have something here, but I'm pretty sure Basic and Expert both have, or at least maybe Basic has. I'm not sure if the Little Brown Books, someone could correct me, the Little Brown Books have a dungeon creation stocking. They might. I'm 99.9999% sure the first edition DMG has it. I'm pretty sure the 5th edition DMG has it if you're playing 5th edition. So there are plenty of stocking tables, and that's not even including all the third-party stuff and homebrew stuff you'll find out on the web. So plenty of options for how to figure out how you want to stock them. And they bring up the general third, should contain creatures, and half, there's some calculus that you could see in how many rooms is suggested to be empty versus filled versus whatnot. So, and you could tweak those to suit. I know that originally the rules were, have a fair amount of empty rooms, and I like empty rooms, but I think sometimes at some point, and I remember when I had my chat with Alyssa about map making, she mentioned that not being, that sometimes it seemed like some of the modules just took it too far and would just have room 36 empty, right? Great. That's makes it really a pressure on the GM in the moment to either make up stuff on the fly for the room or just to turn to the party and says, it's empty, which is not particularly fun. I think empty means it has nothing necessarily of significance, but you want to probably put in some details, figure out what that room might have been before it was emptied out. What was it? Why is it empty? Why hasn't something taken up residence here? What was it originally? Maybe there's traces of it still there, not enough to be of value or of interest, but you could talk about, I like to think about like rubble and, maybe it's a bedroom that just got, it's just everything's kind of rotted away, or storage that's gone bad and there's just nothing in there. Even the giant centipedes or whatever vermin have already left because there's nothing further to eat. But you just, add some character, right? So you can have empty rooms, but they don't have to be characterless. Okay, now we're going to establish wandering encounters. The inhabitants of a structured dungeon are unlikely to spend every waking hour sequestered in their assigned rooms. Creatures wander, inhabitants have tasks in different places, and things happen independently of the explorations of the heroes. At this stage, you should create a table or list of potential encounters that the PCs can run into while traversing the dungeon or exploring its rooms. He mentions a table with 6 entries is usually sufficient. Yeah, that's pretty good. I think a lot's going to depend. Modern, I won't say modern, but in air quotes, are big on places having particular characters, so that you're in a goblin caves, you're going to find in there different variations of goblins, and not the mystical underworld style of caves where there might be goblins and bugbears and trolls and hill giants and gelatinous cubes and giant rats, all kind of living in kind of pseudo harmony, or at least a weird balance kind of thing. So the one fun thing about that extensive kind of mythical underworld where all kinds of stuff can show up and all kinds of things are coming in restocking, either before the PCs showed up, just things are happening and the populations are in flux, maybe is a good way to think about it, is that you have lots of fodder for lots of interesting encounters. And players, you have to be on your toes because you don't know what you're going to run into. You can't count into the fact that, okay, there were goblins back there, therefore there are going to be goblins up ahead. Could be goblins, could be something radically different. You don't know, so make sure to listen and do all the work. It can seem a little bit, unrealistic or maybe more difficult to suspend your disbelief because things seem a little kind of funhouse, that funhouse dungeon style where, hey, one room's full of fire elementals, the next room's full of water elementals, and that's just what it is. But it was this idea that that these underground places were kind of mythical and that all kinds of things were happening. Things were bubbling up from places impossibly deep below them that are clawing their way through cracks and coming out through the doors. And from the entrances that are open into the wilderness, things are creeping in and they're all interacting. Now, I think certainly in the more modern games, in dungeons that take that modern sensibility, you tend to find this is a goblin hold, and so what's in there is goblins. And for that kind of thing, 6 entries in a table might seem like not only enough, but actually a lot. Because one of the things you want to do is you want to try to vary up the encounters. So if you think about it, if you have, and let's just say in this an example, we're dealing just with goblins. We're not dealing with goblins and hobgoblins and a smattering of orcs. This is a goblin tribal home. And maybe other than a leader who, let's say a leader's a hobgoblin or something like that, it's all straight up goblins. So when you think about that and you're trying to fill out 6 entries on a table, not only does it not seem like a little, you could find your imagination be pushed a little bit. Something that I like to do, and I'm certainly not alone, didn't invent this kind of technique, is to have different encounter groups. So instead of, might have one encounter 1, 2d4 goblin guards. And maybe you write down some notes about what kind of equipment goblin guards have. Maybe they use shields and short spears, and they have daggers, and they're in, they've got leather armor, crude wooden shields, leather armor, short spears that they can throw or wield one-handed, and then some daggers or knives for backup. That's encounter 1. Encounter 2 might be dogs or some other domesticated beast that they use for patrol, or even could be, depending on how you want to see how they do with food, maybe there's just pigs running wild, like you see in those medieval villages when they would have that first shot of, think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, when the king is going through the village and chickens are scattering at their approach and pigs are just squealing and moving out of the way of the horse, whatever, or not the horse, out of coconut shell sound range. But they usually have that scene in a medieval show where they'll show, look, let's show how dirty and disgusting these villages are, and the animals just running around free. So you could have, what did the goblins feed on? And maybe something like that. Maybe you run a third one is goblin servants. They're goblins, or maybe they're thralls to the goblins, poor souls who are stuck there and enslaved or whatever, but they're not combatants necessarily. They're carrying plates, they're cleaning up, they're just going from job to job. It's a goblin carpenter, it's a goblin water bearer, something like that. Then you might have a third or fourth one, depending. Maybe you have livestock or just a goblin guards was one, livestock was the second one, sort of goblin civilians, if you will, is the third one. Then maybe the fourth one is kind of guard animals, these animals that are there for protection. You could look at, if you want to go Tolkien style, maybe a warg, some kind of pseudo domesticated wolf or dog, or even could be fun like a war pig. Maybe they got some wild pigs that they've kind of domesticated and turned into their version of guard dogs. And then you could mix and match. You could have, and then you could have a mixed group. Some guards, some dogs, some this or some that. Or you could roll twice on the table and you get these kind of mixed. And that way you can get a sense of some diversity and you're not stuck with just the same kind of group of goblins showing up everywhere you go. But it can be a challenge. I would probably have more than 6 on my personal table, but especially if you're sticking with one main type of creature, creating a large table can be a lot more work for reduced amounts of payoff as you go. So think about a number that works for you and one that allows you to both keep your workload down, right, but highlight, the diversity in these in these places, in these dungeon areas. See, Terrence says, back to empty rooms, says, I don't think of empty rooms, just encounter free rooms. Yep, I think that's a good way to think of it, right? They don't have treasure, they don't have creatures, they don't have traps, but they were something. People don't usually just build rooms to just be empty. And if they do, it's kind of weird, right? If you went to someone's house and they had, and here's my empty room, and it's just an empty space, that would seem weird, right? So for those things, you want to think about what might it have been. Hey, nothing in the house. And I think it says empty rooms usually seem unrealistic. Are things living there? How many total empty rooms are in people's houses? Right, pretty much beat me to the punch in a sense, but I spoke first and read second, so I win the punch. Ha. And then Terrence says, unless you're a real live Spartan, dungeon rooms need a description and a function. I guess empty just means empty of things an adventurer might care about. I think that's ideally what empty means, right? Empty should be nothing ultimately useful or dangerous in the room. But I think we always want to think in these dungeons about what was the room there for. And sometimes it can be, you don't know, because it could be a cave-in, you want to, which might be a room to highlight nothing particular within it, but just the fact that the place is dangerous since it's falling apart. Maybe there's a giant hole that got pushed up. I was just talking about how creatures, especially if you take that kind of mythical underworld approach, you have creatures who are coming in from the surface, including usually the adventures, but there are also creatures that might be coming in from below. Maybe they dug a hole in there and everything just fell down and collapsed into rubble, and so you kind of have a pit there. I mean, you can do all kinds of stuff there, right? But yeah, I think the idea is empty rooms shouldn't just be, here's just a blank 10 by 10 weird place that with nothing in it. John Lennon says, I now favor using node maps. You could superimpose a node map on a nice detailed map and get the best of both worlds. Yeah, I think, especially as for me, I don't make player-facing maps. Then it really frees you from having to make a beautiful map full of, the drawing out all the corridors and everything. You can really use nodes. I used to call mine, I use the mind mapping term, but any kind of node map, point crawl. And you can just make notes. This line from this room to that room, 120 feet, 10 feet wide, right? Maybe you could put a little, you'd even put some notes on there just in the map itself, since you're going to be saving a lot of space by not drawing everything out precisely. Hey, here are some characteristics, right? It's got a smooth stone walls, rough stone floor, damp, slight breeze, right? John Lennon also adds, Mark Cuban had a giant mansion, 90% of which was empty. He used the ballroom as a basketball court. There you have it. I've never been to Mark Cuban's house. I'm sure that was on some show or something. But I think the point is that even it being empty, right, it had a purpose, right? It was a ballroom once, became a basketball court, and then presumably 1,000 years after Mark Cuban and all his heirs have maybe moved on, then when someone finds it, they'll find traces of that, right? They'll see the basketball court stuff, and then maybe if they were to look a little bit past it, they might see, oh, this was once a ballroom. Usually there's a trace of kind of what the room was originally. Obviously, if you're dealing with natural caves, you have a little more leeway, because some things have just been created by erosion and might not have much of a purpose, but you want to speak about that. Right, you want to speak of what's there. I think it'd be weird if over thousands of years, however long these places are, that places are just kind of clean and nothing was ever in them. I just think that something would go there, even just to check it out, make a poop, and then leave. And then maybe you find a petrified poop in there. Make it interesting. Even if you can always find exceptions to the rules. There's probably some guy living who like Mark Cuban's house. Yeah, 90% of my rooms are empty. Okay, but that doesn't make it that interesting. The 1% of folks who have tons of empty rooms probably don't want to pick that as your inspiration. I would pick the 99.99% of people who put stuff in their rooms. Terrence says, laughs at the thought of future adventurers going through our tacky ruins. Yeah, Absolutely. I mean, that's the we're back to kind of Thundar territory, right? It's walking around the ruins of our cities, trying to find love for Ukla the Muck. All right, so we got established wandering encounters, I think. Yeah, he talks about 6 entries being sufficient. Hex crawls, you also want some sort of wandering encounter table. That is true. So we got that, and then we want to establish a daily life. Now that you know who is where in a site-based dungeon, take a moment to think about their interactions and relationships. The initial inhabitant framework roles may have given you some clues about how these groups relate to each other, but here you should nail down the specifics. If the Anak warband squatting in the old amphitheater hates the human bandits that fortified the ruined caravansary, then you could expect they'll keep a distance from each other when not fighting. If the dungeon is a subterranean deep, how do the occupants get food and water, and what do they do with their time? Do any of the inhabitants venture out of their home areas, and if so, where do they go? And these are good thoughts. They will inform that context that you're building up when your party is tracking through those areas. Let's see. Terrence says, we think this ancient culture worshipped these things called Funko Pops. Yeah, I know. It's the plastic. It's all the plastic gunk that's going to that's going to survive us all that they will be finding, and they will think our culture even shallower than it really is, which is pretty shallow already. This is all good stuff, right? You want to think about how the monsters are going, and I like the idea of thinking about, well, where do they get their food? Where do they get their water? Somebody commented on my Keep of the Borderlands video, like, what does the troll need gold for? Right. And those are interesting questions to ask. I like to think of the kind of in Tolkien. I don't know if they ever called it officially, but I think they talk about kind of a concept of, I think they call it dragon sickness or something similar, in which you are around enough treasure that you kind of become obsessed with it, much like dragons, the act of having a bunch of gold. Sort of what happens to Thorin Oakenshield in The Hobbit, right? The act of just possessing treasures becomes its own reward, which could be something with trolls and other creatures. It doesn't have to be just dragons. So that's one thing. But another thing is, it's valuable. Everybody, anything intelligent knows that gold and the stuff having is valuable, that people will trade you things for it, that having more of it gives you some kind of power. So yeah, maybe they do trade it back and forth. Maybe the troll trades it with the goblins for some food or water or whatnot, right? It could very well be used, even if it's not used as currency so much as used as bartering. If the troll is deeper inside the dungeon, never really goes out much, and there's no source of food or water, and it doesn't want to go out for whatever reason, but you have, say, kobolds who are much nearer the entrance, maybe they do make some kind of trade, and the kobolds, I don't know, melt down the gold for their own uses, or to send to their dragon god that lives nearby, and in exchange they bring the troll stuff, or the troll then goes out and tries to beat low-level adventurers to a pulp, bring back their stuff to trade for something else, right? So there, you can think about all kinds of interesting ideas, and maybe you just want to keep it on a light kind of funhouse level and not worry about it, but it's good to at least think about. Oh no, Terrence, why'd you have to do this? He needs exact change for his job at Troll Bridge. The Troll Bridge. Yep, you will see yourself out. Yeah, that was rough. John Lance says trolls have treasure because they don't have 401ks. Yep. Yeah, they don't have any. There's no bonds. It would be really cool if it's and maybe someone's done this and some being a little bit cheeky, but having fun with the monsters. You know, being like part of a co-op of a dungeon and having shares, and maybe having improvements or traps and things are established with kind of bonds. Maybe the kobolds run the custodial work of setting up all this stuff, and folks have to ante up and pay their share every month to stay on good terms. It's a real cooperative living. Could be, right? All right, let's see what else we got. And then copy the final map. This was the next step for site-based dungeons. Once you've got everything arranged on the table to your liking and have decided which rooms might be affected by optional map features, copy the map to your notes for the site. Simple dungeon room numbers and names connected by straight lines are usually sufficient, with any terrain features noted alongside the connection lines. During play, you can consult the map and then pull out the relevant room cards to handle the exploration of these individual places. So basically, kind of making, like we were talking about, having some kind of nodes or other mind mapping, point crawling, however you want to do it, to kind of put everything together. And then, I don't know if this is the final step, but the next, making a detailed map. For many groups, a stylized map is sufficient for exploring a structure. They really don't want to pay attention to mazy blank corridors or twists and turns of dungeon interactions. Each room of interest dimensions and shapes are important to the encounters within, but the nebulous spaces in between are glossed over with a few words about dank dungeon tunnels or empty streets. Other groups want something more specific. They enjoy the process of mapping a dungeon, or the GM wants to take advantage of the kind of traps and obfuscations that work best in the connecting spaces between points of interest. In that case, the GM can take the stylized map and use it as a framework for laying in individual corridors, intersections, turns, and twists. And then he gets into using graph paper. I would say you actually can make that stuff on your final map. Like I was saying, if you don't want to create what he's calling a detailed map, which is where you're using something like graph paper and you're sketching out all your 10-foot corridors and you're setting up, or using squares as 5-foot spaces or 10-foot spaces, and you're doing all that work. And a lot of people do that, or they virtually do it because they're going to be throwing it up on a virtual tabletop for everybody. But if you're like me and you're working theater of the mind, you can have all the distances, because the distances are important in the sense that they require time, and time you're ticking off, I hope, taking off the time that's passing, which is setting off your wandering monster encounters and setting off your light sources going out, setting off spells expiring. All these different things are happening tied to time. So I wouldn't want the distances between the points of interest to be just nebulous, where you hand wave them away, because they do have, if nothing else, if there's no traps, if there's no obstacles, if there's no monsters in between them, if nothing else, it's important that time be ticking off. And of course, if you do wandering monsters, there's no reason why they couldn't show up in the hallway or some other of these connective spaces. And then what that connective space is like does become of paramount importance. But like I said before, you can just write that stuff in. If you're doing theater of the mind, I don't need to draw myself out a whole bunch of 10, one grid wide corridors by however many grid long corridors. I can just make a note saying these are 10 foot wide, it goes 120 feet, and here are some notes about it, right? I can just have that in the margins of my nodes on those connecting lines, and that gives me everything that I need. Still allows me to give good descriptions, and I can get more technical with the shape of it. Maybe it does a zigzag after 50 feet, right? Or it's a L. You can just write out sort of the notes on the shape that you want if they're not straight lines, and usually they're not, or it curves, or it has an S shape, right? Whatever you want. You can throw all that in there, but still have enough detail for if you need encounters, and have enough detail so that you could confidently say it took you 20 minutes to walk down this stretch of corridor. Therefore, whatever happens on those 2 10-minute exploration ticks will now tick off. Okay, now your torches are running low, or now I'm going to roll for my wandering monster check, or whatever it is that you're doing. Now we're going to get some. Okay, this is an interesting, a little bit of a different kind of table here. For the first time, he's kind of broken the mold of kind of the earlier tables, or at least tables we've seen thus far. This is types of ruin sites. The table below offers suggestions as to what kind of structure the exploration site might be. So first we would roll a d6 to get a basic type. And I will just read off the basic type since there's only 6. Residential, military, production, religious, cultural, or infrastructure. From there, we roll, looks like a D12. It says D12. I see. So then for each one, they split it as a D12, but they put the lists, they break it up into 2 groups of 6 so that they can fit. It's kind of more to fit everything in on the page. I'm not going to read all of these. Let's see. Nothing says, I'm surprised how often I hear detail maps connected passages aren't necessary in my games. 95% of combat happens in corridors. PCs never fight in an open room. Is this just me? I don't think it is. I don't think it's just you. I have a lot of combats end up in those odd spaces as well. I like it because the corridors are more intriguing in most ways. Because I don't like to think. I know it's kind of the modern thinking. Like you see this a lot with the folks that make maps for, either through Patreon. I'll just say, for purchase, right? Either through Patreon support or just outright to buy, they always concentrate on these big, especially if it's a battle map type thing, right? They concentrate on a singular room, and there's usually some kind of central feature of interest in that room. The Not always split exactly in half, but often split with kind of sort of in half, or two, I don't maybe 2/3 to a third, but usually I feel like there's kind of half, and then you can array your bad guys around, and maybe part of the puzzle is getting from one half to the other. I think of all the rooms that are bisected by lava, or bisected by a chasm, or bisected by a rushing underground river. Right? There's oftentimes is some bisecting element. Sometimes there's also a central element. I don't know. I can't even count how many rooms I've seen where you have, there's a river of lava running through it, and in the kind of the center, there's a fountain of lava, but there's some, that's where these walkways are, right? So it's who's going to get to the walkways first and get across. I don't even know how the tactics would actually work, but that kind of thing, and it's fine. But I find that when you start down that path, you have to always try to one up yourself. If this is what your party runs into at level 1, then in the next adventure, okay, now I got to try to do better. Like, how can I keep making it better, right? How can I keep upping the pace, upping the ante? But I find that when you get into corridors, either because you open a door and something's in a room, but you realize, we shouldn't open that door and we need to retreat, or the things rush at you, or they run away. When you get in the corridors, you really get a totally different character to the fight. It can be a running battle. A lot of folks can have cover if they're intelligent and they're using corners to their advantage. Maybe they're doing kind of a fighting retreat. Maybe your party is forced to do kind of a fighting withdrawal. Suddenly you're worried more about what's at your back. You can't just close the doors in the room and say, okay, now we can have our nice fight in this little arena and nothing's going to bother us. Now you have to be thinking about, did we clear out all the rooms behind us? Something else coming? Navigation becomes an issue. Have you kept track of where you are in the dungeon? Because in my games, I'm not going to tell you this is the way you came. If you were doing your fighting withdrawal and you come back to an intersection, it's up to you to remember which way you came. I'm not going to tell you, so you better remember, or have made a mark with a crayon or a chalk on the floor or the wall, or you better know somehow. Otherwise, you might end up running into things you hadn't seen yet because you thought you were heading back towards the exit, and instead you're heading further in. And those narrow confines mean that now your party can't necessarily get set up the way they might when they can just march out in good Napoleonic order in a large room, and okay, the fighters are going to be up here, and behind them is going to be here, and this is going to be here. Now suddenly the wizard's trying to cast the spell, but they can't see because they got the fighter and the cleric is ahead of them in the lineup, and the fighter was ahead of them, and maybe the thief was ahead of them. Suddenly everyone's kind of jockeying to, hey, can you get out of the way so I can get in here? And I can't see them. And of course the enemy is bottlenecked potentially also. So how do they handle that? Right? I find there's a lot more of that interest, and it becomes interesting without the places themselves having to get more and more crazy. This could just be a regular corridor, stone, and it's still going to have a lot of interest. So I definitely agree with that. I just don't think I necessarily need it all graphically represented. Just having those notes for me is kind of enough. I don't mind a graphical representation. And if I'm using a map that I've already drawn, because I kind of like drawing maps sometimes, or I'm using one from online, that's great. But ultimately, I don't need those. That's me. Now, nothing does add, they'd be better off with maps of hallways and abstract rooms. Yeah, somewhat. I mean, it really depends on where your enemies are and what they're doing. But so many, modules and things and dungeons have everybody pretty much sequestered in rooms, and it's really only the wandering monsters that get called out potentially in corridors, unless there's guards standing in front of a door, kind of thing, right? But I do like to vary it up, and I think the more exciting battles are those ones that even if they start off in a room, kind of spill out into the surrounding environment. So I'll read a few of these for each of the types. So for residential sites, we have isolated rural estates, a compact fortified village, a hidden shelter against the calamity, an outpost of refugees. For a military site, we might have a remote frontier keep, an isolated watchtower, or a battered frontline fortress. And of course, there's other ones. For production, it might be a sacred shrine for a holy product, not project, some kind of, magical production facility, an overgrown ancient plantation. Religion could be a lost pilgrimage destination, the tomb of some mighty ancient, a prison monastery for heretics. That sounds interesting. A place of some holy trial or test. Culture, we've got an ancient culture's gathering site, a monument complex, an abandoned school or study center, a massive ceremonial structure. And then for infrastructure, could be a canal or aqueduct control center, some kind of massive bridge or tunnel, a huge ancient dam. Right? So good stuff in there. Good fodder for thought. Hey, Frederick Ork, late but you made it. You did make it. And welcome. And he also says hallways are where fights happen. I find that to be true. I find that it's much more advantageous if you're the players to fight from in the hallway into the room if you can, because you can get cover and generally your enemies are exposed. I've never quite understood the parties that just bust into rooms and go charging in. Maybe you want your fighter to charge in since they want to get close. But I think holding the door and being able to have, depending on how you run cover, half cover, 3/4 cover, or just cover, and being able to just fire in, at least having your back line, be able to fire in for cover is nice, which tends to then force your opponents to figure out how to dislodge you from that cover, which oftentimes might be getting around the fighter and charging you, or trying to find cover of their own. And that might often be then them leaving. If there's another exit to the room, then you might take to that exit. And then, now it's up to, did the party just want to get in the room? In which case, yeah, you're in the room. You've got the room. Or if that's somebody, we need to eliminate those hostiles or do something else, then you got to decide if you're going to follow them. And following them means you give up your advantage because now you have to enter the open space and move across it, and they get to just hammer you from cover. Frederick Ork says, if you have a knight in the party, charge that room. Yeah, you could definitely send out your heavy fighters, or if you have them, into those spaces. That's kind of one of the benefits of being that heavy character in full plate, or just whatever heavy armor you have. I saw firsthand, what some folks what can happen to some characters when they run out into space and don't have protection or cover or both. And that was they got knocked out. They got killed in pretty short order. It was definitely a learning exercise for that crew. All right, so now we're getting to the next part here is the framework of inhabitation. Some sites will have no significant inhabitants, no monsters, no skulking raiders, no wild beasts, or abominable flora worth mentioning. Most, however, will have something dwelling in the place. And here we get some suggestions. We're back to kind of the normalized, the standard tables that we've seen. Frederick Ork says, get one tank in the back and one in front of the monsters. Yep, you can do that. What I like to play with those my BX game, right? There's no opportunity attacks. I became not a fan of opportunity attacks anyway, but there's no opportunity attacks. So you better hope that your fighter, you got a 5-foot space or something, because monsters will just go right around that guy and get around them, unless you made a concerted effort to find a spot where you could put, say, the fighter and the cleric, if they're both heavily armored, or someone else, right? If you have a 10-foot corridor or something wide to get in there. Doorways I usually have as being smaller, so you could put the fighter in the doorway, maybe potentially, or in front of the doorway to kind of hold it. But you got to be careful, because they can and will go right around you. Oh, Ovaltine Patrol in the house. Hey, Ovaltine Patrol. Back when my group played Rise of the Rune Lords, we ended up calling our party the Hall Monitors for all the tiny corridors sandwiched between the doors we ended up fighting in. Well, there you go. Absolutely. It really, I feel like it seems like a lot of folks in here are already utilizing hallways. If you're a GM and if you're putting all your combats in rooms, don't sleep on having them spill out into the corridors, or have them start in the corridors. It really will change the dynamic of the combat. If only it makes the party have to be a little bit more thoughtful about what they do. because, like I said, they can't just walk up in good order and just, like two colonial armies and necessarily set up the way they want. And you can certainly play with sound, and if there are other monsters around, do they come, and from which direction do they come? And suddenly now your back line, like Frederick Ork was saying, you potentially need to have somebody well armored on your back behind you because something might come up behind you. Good times. And then Michael Fraker says, Gloomhaven and Descent style games teach players bad lessons for OSR. I mean, I think a lot of things teach bad lessons. I think the way I see a lot of 5e combat tend to work, and I probably not even just 5e, but I just think of 5e because it's what I've seen most lately, teach players bad lessons, which is often that. I remember I even got into an argument with somebody on Twitter where they were just like, the fighter comes up and presents himself. Why don't the enemies just attack the fighter? It's like, well, why do they need to attack the fighter? The fighter needs to make things attack it. Otherwise, you see the thing that's in a walking, encased in metal, but you're in a wide room and you see that there's a wizard in a robe and he's getting ready to cast fireball, or he's already laced you once with magic missiles, and you've got oodles of space. Why not take care of the magic user, right? Get him off the board and then come back to the fighter. You have to impose yourself. It's not that somehow the party and the monsters match up. Okay, frontline monsters, go fight the frontline characters. Okay, back-end monsters, attack the back-end characters. Okay, like that's not how it works. There should be reasons. But for them, it was just, they couldn't even, it was foreign to them. Like, well, why wouldn't the thing attack the fighter? It's like, well, why would it exactly? Frederick Ork says, never shoot black powder weapons underground. You will choke to death on the smoke. Well, that's true if your GM is thinking about that. And he also says, a lot of time the monsters are avoiding the fighter. Yeah, absolutely. Save the fighter for last. Save the fighter so you can get them surrounded. Or maybe if you're intelligent, right, get the other party members down, or get a couple of them down, put knives to their throats and say, hey, fighter, drop your weapons, or otherwise it's coup de grace time, right? I mean, a lot of interesting ways to deal with, especially you only have a couple of armored folk, and there's a lot of room to maneuver. I mean, and that's why it's incumbent on the party to force the action where it's best for them, and on the monsters are going to try to force the action situations that are best for them. And that's true even if you want to say they're animals, right? You look at the way animals operate, look at predators. They're always trying to create the most advantageous position for themselves. They're not stupid, right? Wolves hunt in packs for reasons. They try to get the weakest alone, away from their protection, and then deal with them that way. They use tactics which are not stupid. They don't just run blindly into things. Because I always hate that. Well, someone will say, well, it's an intelligent monster will do that. But if it's just an animal, it'll just do whatever. It's like, have you watched animal shows? Have you watched programs about any kind of predator or prey? They don't do stupid things. They have a store of knowledge that comes from instinct and different things than we do, but they don't tend to act just dumb. You don't see and say, like, here's the gazelle leaping towards the lion's mouth because it's stupid. Or here's the lion that bolts into the middle of all the adult wildebeest so they can kick him to death. No, they don't do that. They actually do act with an intelligence that belies the fact that we think of them as merely, animals. Play your monster smart, even if they're just animals. Play them smart. That's my bottom line. And Frederick Ork says, my fighter Valkyman had a rep as the one who gave the disfiguring scar to Lilith's high priestess. Hey, those are always the great stories, right? Hopefully he lived to tell the tale, and it wasn't like Fingolfin and Morgoth, where he hewed a nice cut in Morgoth's foot that made him limp, but died in the process. Okay, so let's get back to this framework of inhabitation. So we're going to get some more tables. This along the lines of the sort of standardized table layout. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tables. We've got potential reasons for hostility. Why did they come here? Important inhabitants. Possible causes for alliances. Ooh, I like that. And then why are they staying? So I'll start with the important inhabitants. Goes from one major monstrous beast to no discernible major figures, only a disorganized conjury of beasts and beings. It's a D6 roll. Potential reasons for hostility is a D12 table ranging from why are they hostile? They raided us and stole our resources. They're from a rival religion. They broke an alliance. They caused a local disaster, right? So on and so forth. Why did they come here? Another D12 table. They were driven here by a terrible monster. They were forced out of their old home. They gathered from scattered exiles. They were enlisted to come by a powerful leader. So on and so forth. Let's see. Possible causes for alliances. We have a shared enemy. Our leaders are friends. We intermarry. We each have goods the other needs. We used to be under the same leader. And then finally, why are they staying here? It's rich in resources. There's an outside foe that threatens them if they leave. They're trying to find something specific that's here. It's always been their home. They have nowhere better to go. So there we go. And now we get some more tables on the types of inhabitants. And these are broken out into the type of site. Some of these look like they're setting specific. Some of them look like they're more generic. We've got Ancient Sorcerer King Ruin, Alien Aratu. I still don't really know what an Aratu is, but at least we know it's something alien. Some kind of alien site. A subterranean deep, a modern ruin, or trackless wilderness. So for the Sorcerer King Ruin, which I'm guessing is also setting specific, but we can kind of come up with, I'm sure, kind of generic analogs. Altered human servitors, a summoned creature that broke its fetters, decorative magic animals gone feral. That's on a D12 roll. Oh, okay. The story on this on Frederick's fighter was they were both retreating out of a room, and his fighter had one attack before she teleported away. She just made that save her spell not to be interrupted. Ooh, nice. So she got away, but she had a scarred reminder. I love those stories. All right, so we got some stuff for the Ancient Sorcerer King Ruin for the Alien Aratu. Another D12 table, animate and lethal plant life, remnants of the aliens, some other fellow adventurers, some trapped human natives. For the Subterranean Deep, might get scavenger beasts, blighted intruders, undead relics of former inhabitants, non-human sentients. For Modern Ruin, might be local bandits, cult of some unacceptable god, remnants of the original inhabitants, refugees, and then for Trackless Wilderness, some kind of alpha predator, some intelligent monstrous being, swarms or pack of dangerous beasts, expedition from a surrounding nation, prospectors or resource hunters. All right. And now we can also generate some rooms of interest. The table below gives different functions and specific examples of rooms that might be found in a site. You can use them verbatim when that would make sense, but you can also use results as general metaphors, converting them to something similar that fits the site's nature, right? So if we're looking for, we're trying to figure out what to do with all the rooms that we have, or maybe we need more rooms, the important ones, but we think, hey, that's not more, but we don't know what they are or what they should be, or maybe we just fleshed them out and said, here, these are residential and these are some work rooms, but we don't know really what should be in them. We can roll on this table. This is similar to the table we saw before with basically 3 columns. One, that's a D6 that gives sort of the basic form or function in this case, and then two columns that represent a D12 table within each one for more specifics. Michael Fraker says, Aratu is a desolate, xenomorphed territory poisoned by the outsiders to make them more homely to the aliens. I see. So it's that kind of anti-terraformed environment. All right. I'll try to keep that in mind. Aratu. I like the word. So for the basic functions, we have, similar to the other one, right? Residential, work, cultural, martial, religious, or utility. And then some examples: residential, dormitory, barracks, a latrine or privy, a kennel or beast pen, guest chambers, kitchen. For a workroom, you might have a smithy, a smokehouse, a torture chamber, a washroom or scullery, a brewery room. For culture, it might be a plaza or meeting area, an amphitheater, an art gallery, a drinking hall, performance or stage area. For a martial room, it could be an armory or some kind of weapons storage, a training area, soldier barracks, a guard post. Religion might be a private shrine, an altar room, a religious equipage storage, a secured chamber for holy relics. Oh, and there's more information on Aratu on page 2. Okay, well, that's what I get for skipping forward. I mean, that was part of the price I paid for doing the book this way is I did bypass all the stuff that would explain the setting specific material because I wanted to concentrate on the campaign building material. And of course, one drawback is that, yeah, all the stuff that was introduced, I totally bypassed. But I appreciate that reference. I will go back and try to read it because I don't want to have to keep saying every stream, what is an Aratu? When it's right there in the book, I'm skipping around. But, that is my lot. To be the skipper. And let's see. Then for utilities, it might be work material storage, pantry, storeroom, furnace, a vault, a barn, a pool. All right. Let's see. How much more do I have here? Because I'm getting up towards the bottom of the arrow. I would like to see hex points of interest. Let me just skip forward just a bit. All right. I guess we'll do hex points of interest and then we'll stop it here because this will be a good stopping point before we get to the next section, which is room layout and map features. All right, so let's read the little intro here. For a hex crawl where a quote-unquote room consists of an entire hex of terrain, a point of interest is defined a little differently. First, decide how many hexes your map should have. How many hexes in your map should have anything particularly interesting at all. One simple way to do is to roll one die. Do so is to roll one die for every hex in your map. On a roll of 1 or 2, there's something worth noticing there. Use 1d6 for the die if you want a densely populated hex crawl, or 1d8, 1d10, or even 1d12 if you want sparser results. Terrence. I was waiting for someone to do that. He's the skipper we all but mere Gilligan's. That's right, little buddies. Unfortunately, they don't seem to play Gilligan's Island on regular TV much. That's one thing I miss. I don't say I want to miss it, but when you only had the kind of regular 8 or 9 channels, you got to see a lot of stuff that was on there. Now everything has its own niche. My daughter's never going to go to TV Land to see Gilligan's Island if it's even playing on TV Land or a TV Land like channel. But if she only had the 8 channels to deal with, she might very well watch some of that stuff before or after waiting for cartoons. But now it's like I'm going to have to kind of push her to see them, if only just to say, hey, look what Daddy used to watch, and then she can turn up her nose and be like, what kind of garbage nonsense is this, old man? But, I will have to have at least sit her down and say, you're going to watch at least one episode of Gilligan's Island. I'm just going to have to do it. Sorry, daughter. You're going to have to do it. It'd be an interesting thought exercise as to which Gilligan's Island episode. I think maybe the one where he gets really fast or they get really old. This all starting to blur together. There's the one where they get all the huge giant vegetables and fruits. There's a lot. I feel like there's a lot of good Gilligan's Island episodes, but I say that having not watched Gilligan's Island in aeons, so who knows what I would think of it now. Interesting that they're talking about kind of a 33% chance of being a point of interest in a hex as being a densely populated hex crawl. I guess I wouldn't think of it that way. I would think maybe 1 in each hex is dense, but even then, depending on how you work your hexes, it's maybe not that dense. I don't know. I think that's why I like starting small with a hex crawl, because I like to err on having something in every hex crawl. It might not be something massive. It might just be a navigational point. In other words, something you can anchor yourself to, that like, hey, where the standing rock that looks like a troll is, or maybe the troll's been turned to stone and now is a standing rock, whatever that is. Now that helps you as a navigational aid, that when you're in that area, you kind of can do that. I kind of think every hex should have something like that. If you think about 30 some odd square miles, which is inside a hex, there's usually something interesting. Maybe if you're in a prairie and it's just flat grassland for hundreds of miles in every direction, you might say, okay, there's nothing. But I think oftentimes those little features you'll find, might just be interesting. They don't have to be a ruin in something of significance, but they can be those navigational tools. And I like to think of it in that sense, to use the video game idea, is that in Assassin's Creed, where you would find the tall buildings, you could kind of go up there and you've kind of got this landmark, and then you would go up and then it would kind of give you that, okay, now I've surveyed the area. And I like to think of having something there that kind of represents, you found the kind of unique thing in this area. Now you kind of know it well enough so that you, when you get close to this, you can find the area. You might not, it might not stick out to you, but you get close enough, you realize, oh, I'm within a few miles of that cave where we killed the owl bear. I can now find my way back there, right? So I kind of like to have that kind of point of interest, but it might not be a full ruin or a full village or something of that nature. Terrence says Gilligan's Island is underrated sci-fi. Yeah, there is actually, depending on the episode, there is quite a bit of sci-fi stuff. I mean, there's it's a lot of things, but yeah, there's definitely those episodes that veer into sci-fi stuff. A Fantasy Trip never cast 3x fire and 2x space. I ruled triple damage. Ouch. I have to read Fantasy Trip. I read it a long time ago, and I got to get back into it. But I don't think these are the kind of hexes they're talking about. So I don't think I don't know that there's a 3 hex fire that goes out actual 9 miles around you. That would be quite a powerful spell. All right. So we want to generate some points of interest here. This is kind of a meta table, this first one, because it's basically telling you which other table to roll on. So you can roll for a basic type of feature, whichever one you roll, you go then to roll on the more detailed table, either a ruin, either a community site, either a court site, or a wilderness site. And then they give you some examples of community sites: a native village, a small colony from a nearby nation, soldier farmers, sectarian village of unorthodox believers, so on and so forth. There are 10 of those. For court sites, there are also 10 of these. Isolated recluses, a monastery or hermit retreat, wizards conducting esoteric business, a small clan living in seclusion. And then for wilderness sites, caves or caverns. Some extreme example of the terrain, right? If you're in sort of hills, maybe you come across a really steep, rocky or tall or some other distinctive hill, a lake or spring or some other water source, a crevice, a rift, broken ground, that kind of thing. And that is it for Hex Points of Interest. So next time, talking about, what are we talking about here? This will be part 7. We'll get into room layout and map features. Thanks, everybody, for joining in this installment. Before you leave, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up if you don't mind, if it pleased you. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. If you feel like, hey, I like this stuff. Let's see. Frederick Ork says a D&D hex would be a mega hex. A regular fantasy trip hex is 4 to 5 feet. Yeah, 5 regular hexes make a mega hex. Yep, I assumed such. John Lennon says Hex Crawl is a node map with too many nodes. I suppose that's definitely one way you can look at it. I think it would be interesting to see if there are ways to combine hex mapping and point crawling. Some way where you can utilize the strengths and weaknesses of both, because I think there is a weakness or a challenge with hex crawling is what do you do with all that space? You're building out this hex map and you've decided every hex is going to have something in it. You can end up having a lot of space to fill, which makes it hard to come up with interesting things, which is another reason why I like to just start as small as I can. I think sometimes with I've used point crawls for myself, but I've never played in one. I don't know if they sometimes feel confining because you feel like you're tied to those point crawl maps. I don't know. I've never used it, right? If there's only one connection between those two nodes, you may not feel like, well, you have to take the road through the forest. It's like, why? I don't want to take the road through the forests. And like, I don't know, having not played a GM who's run something specifically through a node crawl, I don't know what you do when your players want to go off node. Maybe I should talk to somebody who's run a node map and ask them about it. Old Team Results says, have a good afternoon, everyone. Absolutely. Have a good afternoon. Let's Let's see. Michael Frager says, turn every 6 mile hex into a node map. I mean, a submap with 3 to 6 points of interest. Yeah, I think that's a way to combine them, right? For inside your hexes, if there's stuff defined in there, then yeah, you can definitely create nodes between them. That might be an interesting way to do it. I'd be curious to see how you would. I'm sure there's someone who's really good at graphic design or information design that would come up with a neat way to show the overall hex and then the nodes in them. Or maybe you just have to have things you can zoom in. Unfortunately, they don't make a lot of software either. Seems to be like, hey, here's your mind mapping software, or here's your hex software if you have it, right? And so you don't have much in between. All right, folks, I'm going to wrap it up. Terrence says later. Cheers, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching or listening to this. Game on, and I will talk to you.